I've been snowboarding since I was a teenager, and I've always considered myself pretty experienced on the slopes. Last winter, I booked a trip to a resort in Colorado, one of those places that look straight out of a postcard, with snow that seemed endless and trails cutting through dense forests. It was supposed to be a fun, relaxing escape from everything else going on in life. But one afternoon changed how I look at snowboarding forever. It was my third day there, and I remember the morning being unusually quiet. The crowds that usually filled the lift lines were gone, and the mountain seemed almost deserted. I figured maybe people were avoiding the colder trails since the temperature had dropped brutally low. I didn't mind though. Having more space usually meant longer, uninterrupted runs. I chose a trail that looked less busy, one that curved along the tree line before opening up to a wider slope. The air felt sharper there, like it had a weight to it. I started my descent, gliding smoothly at first, the crunch of snow beneath my board oddly louder than usual. That's when I noticed something off in the woods. At first I thought it was another skier, maybe someone who had stopped to take a break. But when I glanced again, I realized he wasn't moving at all. He was just standing there between the trees, completely still. The strangest part was his outfit. It looked outdated, like something from decades ago, with a bright red jacket and old-fashioned goggles. I slowed my pace, telling myself it was probably just a guy with vintage gear. But the way he stood, angled directly toward me, made my stomach tighten. I couldn't see his face clearly, but I felt his eyes locked onto me even through the dark glass of his goggles. It wasn't normal. People don't just freeze in the woods like that, especially in freezing weather. My board edged to a stop, and for a few seconds we just stared at each other from a distance. I couldn't hear anything. Not the wind, not the scrape of branches, not even my own breathing. Just this heavy silence that seemed to swallow the mountain around us. Then, as quickly as I noticed him, I blinked and he was gone. I looked around frantically, scanning the slope, the woods, and the sky above me. There was no trail of fresh snow that would have shown him leaving, no crunch of boots or sound of skis. My chest pounded, and I tried to brush it off, telling myself maybe I had imagined it. But something inside me kept whispering that what I saw was real. I pushed forward, forcing myself down the slope again, hoping the movement would clear my head. The run was longer than I expected, the trees bending in closer with every turn. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me, tracking each move. Even when I sped up, the tension never let go, like invisible eyes were glued to my back. When I reached the bottom of the slope, my instructor was waiting near the lift. He noticed right away that something was off with me. I must have looked pale because before I could even explain, he asked if I was okay. I hesitated, then told him I thought I'd seen someone standing in the woods, watching me. He didn't laugh like I expected. Instead, his face tightened, and he glanced toward the trail I had just come from. "Which slope were you on?" he asked carefully. When I pointed back, his expression darkened even more. He told me that particular trail had been closed for years. My stomach dropped at the sound of his voice. The resort wasn't the type to leave trails abandoned unless there was a serious reason. I pressed him for more, and he hesitated before answering. Finally, he said a man had died on that slope back in the 70s. The story was that he went off course into the trees and never made it back. After that, accidents piled up until they shut it down completely. I stood there in disbelief, trying to process what he had just said. My instructor could see I was shaken, so he told me to stick to the main trails for the rest of the day. I agreed, but my mind kept going back to that figure. The outdated jacket, the old goggles, it all lined up with what he had just told me. Back inside the lodge, I couldn't stop replaying it in my head. I kept telling myself maybe it had been another guest wearing retro gear. Ski fashion sometimes came back in style, right? But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. The way he stared, the way he disappeared, it didn't feel human. It felt like something that shouldn't have been there. That night, I stayed awake longer than I should have. Every little sound in the hallway made me jump. At one point, I swore I heard the muffled scrape of skis outside my window. When I finally got up the courage to peek, there were faint tracks leading into the trees, tracks that hadn't been there earlier. I barely slept, and by morning, my nerves were shot. Still, part of me wanted to prove to myself that I wasn't imagining things, so against my better judgment, I decided to head back to that trail, just to take one last look. The sign marking it closed stood half buried in snow, weathered and cracked like it had been there forever. I hesitated for a long time, staring at the entrance, my board already strapped on. The slope looked calm and quiet, the kind of untouched snow people dream about riding. but I couldn't shake the thought of him standing there, still watching, still waiting. My gut told me I was making a mistake, but I pushed off anyway. The trail was silent in a way that didn't feel natural. My board cut smoothly across the untouched snow, but every turn felt heavier, like the mountain itself didn't want me there. The trees pressed close on either side, their branches weighed down with snow, bending toward me like they were leaning in to listen. It was beautiful, but the beauty felt wrong. Halfway down, I slowed, unable to shake the feeling of being followed. I kept glancing back, but the slope behind me stayed empty, only my own trail snaking back uphill. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw him again. The man in the red jacket stood just off the trail, his posture frozen exactly as before. This time, though, he was closer. His goggles faced me directly, and I knew without a doubt he was watching. I tried to call out, but my throat tightened, the words dying before they left my mouth. The air felt colder, sharper, as if it burned with every breath. I forced myself to push forward, but it was like dragging myself through quicksand. The woods grew darker the further I went, even though it was still daylight. My ears picked up the faintest sound, skis gliding across snow. Not mine. They stayed perfectly in rhythm with my movements, too deliberate to be random wind or falling branches. Every hair on my body stood on end. Someone, or something, was pacing me. I tried to convince myself to stop, to walk back up, but my legs wouldn't obey. The trail curved ahead into a narrow stretch, shadows pooling between the trees. My breathing turned shallow as the sound of skis behind me grew louder, like someone was gaining speed. I didn't dare look back, terrified of what I might see. When the trail finally widened, I took the chance and turned around. The space was empty. No one stood there, no tracks marked the untouched snow, yet the feeling of eyes boring into me only grew stronger. It was unbearable, as if the mountain itself had become alive and was watching through him. I rushed the rest of the way down, not caring about control or style anymore. My only goal was to get back to the lodge, to be surrounded by people again. When I reached the bottom, the instructor spotted me instantly. He didn't even ask what happened. He just shook his head slowly as if he already knew. That night, I packed my things and left earlier than planned. I didn't care about wasting the rest of my trip. Even driving away, I couldn't shake the sense that the man in the red jacket was still there, standing in the trees, waiting for the next person foolish enough to take that slope. I've told this story to a few people since, but most just laugh it off, assuming I was tired or spooked by being alone. I wish they were right, because deep down, I know what I saw, and I know he's still there. Sometimes when the nights are cold enough, I swear I can still hear skis gliding across the snow. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to like, share, and subscribe. I never thought a simple family trip could leave me with memories that still keep me awake at night. It was the middle of winter when my wife and I decided to take our daughter to a rented cabin in Vermont. The cabin sat at the end of a narrow, snow-covered road surrounded by tall pines, far from the busy ski lodges nearby. At first, the place seemed calm, almost too calm, the kind of quiet that felt like it was hiding something. Our daughter was 6 at the time, full of excitement about the snow and the hills behind the cabin. The first thing she asked to do after we unpacked was build a snowman in the yard. I bundled her up in layers, and we spent nearly an hour rolling snow until it formed a tall, uneven figure. By the time we added sticks for arms and a crooked smile, the snowman stood facing the cabin like a strange little guard. I snapped a few pictures of her next to it, laughing with pink cheeks and frost clinging to her hair. She seemed so proud of her creation that I didn't think twice about its placement. From her upstairs bedroom window, the snowman was perfectly visible, almost as if it had been positioned to watch over her. At the time, I thought it was sweet. Later, I'd come to regret leaving it there. That night, the house groaned and creaked with every gust of wind against its wooden frame. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of small footsteps padding down the hall. My daughter appeared in our room clutching her blanket tightly, her face pale. She whispered that she couldn't sleep because the snowman outside was smiling at her window. My wife gave me a tired look, one that silently said it was just her imagination. Still, I took her back to bed and pulled the curtains closed over her wide window. She looked uneasy even under the blankets, her eyes darting toward the fabric as though she expected it to move. I reminded her that snowmen don't smile, kissed her forehead, and told her she'd feel better in the morning. As I left the room, I couldn't shake the weight of her words. Something about the way she had said it felt too certain, too real for a child's fantasy. Back in my bed, I lay staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint whistle of wind through the trees. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured that lopsided face outside, the crooked mouth somehow stretched wider. The next morning, I went straight to the window to prove to myself there was nothing unusual. The snowman stood exactly as we had built it, leaning slightly to one side with stick arms frozen mid-reach. My daughter, however, wouldn't look outside at all. Over breakfast, she barely touched her food, and when I asked her why, she simply said in a flat tone, "Because he smiled at me again." Her voice was so matter-of-fact that it unsettled me more than if she had cried. I told myself kids had vivid imaginations, but deep down, I felt the same strange tug I had felt in the night. Something in me didn't want to check the snowman's face too closely. The idea of staring at it long enough to notice a difference made me uneasy in a way I couldn't explain. I brushed it off, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the trip wasn't going to be as peaceful as we'd planned. That afternoon, my wife suggested we all go sledding on the hill nearby to distract our daughter. For a while it worked. Her laughter carried through the trees as she zipped down the slope, forgetting the snowman in the yard. I stayed at the top, watching them, but when I looked back toward the cabin, I froze. From that distance, I could swear the snowman wasn't leaning anymore. It stood straighter, almost purposeful. I didn't mention it to anyone, convincing myself it was just a trick of the angle. By the time we returned, dusk had fallen and the yard looked darker, the snow reflecting the last glow of the sky. My daughter wouldn't walk past the snowman on her own. She gripped my coat tightly, her eyes never leaving its crooked face. The closer we got, the more uneasy I felt too, like its presence was heavier than just packed snow. That night, the air inside the cabin was tense. My wife and I sat in the living room reading when we heard our daughter moving upstairs again. I sighed, assuming she was coming back to our room, but instead, I heard her talking quietly through her window. My chest tightened. I couldn't make out the words, but the rhythm of her voice was unmistakably like a conversation. I rushed upstairs, opening her door softly. She was kneeling on her bed, peeking out from behind the curtains. When I asked who she was talking to, she jumped, startled, then looked at me with wide eyes. "He asked me to come outside," she whispered. Her words made my stomach turn cold, and when I pulled back the curtains, I found myself staring into the snowman's crooked face, lit by the pale moon. I tried to reassure her, pulling her away and tucking her under the covers. She pressed her little hands against mine, whispering, "Please don't let him in." I told her the snowman was just that, snow and sticks, but even as I said it, the words felt hollow. I closed the curtains tightly and sat with her until her breathing slowed into sleep. Still, I didn't want to leave her room. Something about the way she'd spoken gnawed at me. Later that night, I couldn't resist one more look. From our bedroom window, I checked the yard again. The snowman was still there, but I noticed something I hadn't before. The line of its mouth wasn't just uneven, it had deepened, curved higher, as though whatever shape it once held had shifted in the cold. My pulse quickened. I backed away from the window, telling myself I was just overtired, just seeing things that weren't there. By morning, I tried to reset everything, to tell myself none of it was real. I even suggested to my wife that we knock the snowman down, but she laughed it off, saying our daughter would be upset. When I asked my daughter at breakfast if she wanted to play outside, she shook her head furiously. "He was moving last night," she said under her breath. The way she said it, quiet, flat, certain, sent a chill through me I couldn't shake. That night, I couldn't sleep. The storm outside had settled into silence, but that silence felt wrong, too heavy for a mountain cabin. Around midnight, I got up to grab some water. Passing by my daughter's room, I noticed her door was cracked open. I peeked in, heart sinking when I saw her bed was empty, the covers pushed back like she had climbed out carefully. Panic rushed through me and I darted to the window. My breath caught in my throat. She was outside in the snow, standing just a few feet from the snowman. The thing towered over her, its crooked grin tilted toward her in a way that made my legs lock. My daughter stood still, arms at her sides, as though listening to something I couldn't hear. I yanked on my boots and coat, bursting out the front door. My feet crunched in the snow as I ran, shouting her name. She turned toward me, her face pale and frightened, but she didn't move. When I finally reached her, she whispered, "He said I'd be safe if I stayed." Her little hand trembled as I grabbed it, pulling her back toward the cabin. As we hurried back inside, I risked one last glance behind us. I swore I saw the snowman's head turn slightly, angled toward me, though I knew snow couldn't shift that way on its own. I bolted the door, shutting every lock I could. My wife rushed down the stairs, confused and panicked, as I tried to explain in broken sentences. She thought I was imagining things, but the look on our daughter's face said otherwise. We kept her in our bed that night, though none of us truly slept. Every creak of the cabin made me sit up, straining to hear. At one point, I could have sworn I heard soft crunching outside the window, like slow steps across fresh snow. I couldn't bring myself to look. I just pulled my daughter closer, pretending not to hear the sound until it stopped. Morning came with no fresh footprints outside, at least none that I could find, but the snowman was still there, and its face seemed sharper, its grin wider than before. I tried to take a shovel to it to knock it over, but the moment I lifted the blade, my daughter screamed for me not to. Her fear was so raw, so desperate, I stopped cold. She whispered that if I touched it, he'd come inside. We cut our trip short that day, packing everything and leaving before nightfall. I didn't say why, not even to my wife, but the tension between us was obvious. As we drove down the mountain road, I glanced back at the cabin one last time. In the distance, near the tree line, I thought I saw the snowman, standing alone, still grinning in the fading light. But what froze me wasn't that it was there. It was that it was no longer in our yard. I don't know if it followed us, or if it's still standing in that empty lot by the cabin. What I do know is my daughter still won't sleep near windows, even back home. Sometimes when the snow falls thick in our yard, I catch her staring out for long minutes, whispering under her breath. When I ask what she's saying, she only answers with a single phrase: "He can still see me." I remember the day so clearly because it started out perfect. The sky was a crisp, cloudless blue, and the slopes were buzzing with people laughing and carving through the snow. My friend Ryan had convinced me to take a weekend trip to a ski resort in Colorado, even though I wasn't much of a skier. He had a way of making every plan sound like the best idea ever, so I went along. The lodge itself had this strange old charm: big wooden beams, a stone fireplace, and photographs of skiers from decades ago hanging on the walls. I noticed some of the photos were in black and white, showing people in outdated gear, smiling stiffly at the camera. Something about their frozen grins unsettled me, but I pushed the feeling away. I told myself it was just the old-timey vibe of the place. That first morning, Ryan cracked a joke as we were strapping on our gear. He pointed at the tree line and said, "Bet there are ghosts hiding in there watching us wipe out." I laughed nervously, though his timing was off. The way the shadows stretched into the snow made the forest look darker than it should have at noon. I shrugged it off and followed him toward the lift. On the lift up the mountain, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It wasn't paranoia exactly, more like the awareness of eyes lingering just long enough to notice. Ryan kept talking about which slopes we'd try, but my attention drifted toward the dense trees below. Their branches looked heavy, like they were sagging under something invisible. The air grew colder as we climbed. When we got to the top, Ryan was all excitement, but I hung back for a moment. The wind carried faint sounds, like voices but muffled and distant. I told myself it was just other skiers or maybe the creaking of the trees. Still, I had to take a deep breath before following Ryan onto the slope. We started our run, and for a while, everything felt normal. The snow sprayed up behind us as we gained speed, the cold biting into my face. I was still unsteady, but Ryan kept glancing back with a grin, encouraging me to keep up. That's when I noticed movement at the edge of the trees. A figure stood there, almost blending into the shadows, but not quite. I slowed down, nearly losing my balance. The figure wasn't wearing modern ski clothes. It looked like something from one of those black and white photos in the lodge. I blinked, and it was gone, as if it had never been there. By the time I caught up to Ryan, he was laughing, throwing snow in my direction. I forced a laugh too, trying to forget what I saw, but the unease followed me all the way to the bottom. When we stopped near the lift, Ryan poked at me for looking pale. "Don't tell me the ghost joke actually got to you," he teased. I tried to joke back, but my voice came out flatter than I intended. That was when the mountain stopped feeling like just a ski resort. That evening, the resort bar was crowded with people warming up after a long day. Ryan was in his element, joking with strangers and telling exaggerated stories of our skiing adventures. I sat by the fire, nursing a hot drink, and tried not to dwell on what I'd seen earlier. The warmth of the flames should have been comforting, but every time the door opened and a gust of cold air swept in, I felt a chill deep in my chest. Ryan eventually came over, carrying 2 beers and wearing his usual grin. "Man, you looked spooked today," he said. "I swear I saw you staring into the woods like something was out there." I shrugged it off, telling him I was just nervous about skiing, but I could see a flicker of curiosity in his eyes, like he knew there was more I wasn't saying. He leaned closer and whispered, "Don't tell me you saw a ghost." The word hung between us longer than it should have. I laughed, but it was forced, and Ryan chuckled too, though his tone was mocking. "Dude, if there are ghosts up here, I hope they push you down the slope so I don't have to watch you struggle." I rolled my eyes, but something about his joke hit me wrong. It reminded me of the figure near the tree line watching, almost waiting. Later that night, as we walked back to our room, the mountain seemed unnaturally quiet. The crunch of our boots echoed louder than it should have, like the snow was amplifying every sound. Ryan was still making light of things, swinging his ski poles dramatically as if fighting off invisible attackers. His laughter echoed into the woods, fading into the still air. It was almost too loud for the silence that followed. As we got inside, Ryan leaned his skis against the wall and tossed his poles onto the bed. He picked one up, pretending to use it as a sword. "Be gone, spirits of the mountain," he announced in a mock heroic voice. I told him to knock it off, but he only smirked and jabbed the pole at the window as if skewering an unseen figure. The humor in his eyes didn't match the unease in my stomach. The moment he set the pole back down, I swear I heard a faint cracking sound. At first, I thought it came from the heater or the wood beams of the building settling. But when I glanced at the pole, I noticed a thin split running along its shaft, as though it had been stressed far beyond what his playful swing could have caused. My throat went dry. Ryan hadn't noticed yet. I didn't mention it right away, telling myself I was imagining things. But later, when Ryan finally picked up the pole again, the split widened with a sharp snap, and the top half bent unnaturally. Ryan stared at it, his joking expression fading into confusion. "What the hell?" he muttered. We both knew he hadn't put any real force on it. That pole had broken on its own. Neither of us laughed this time. He set it down carefully, and the room felt colder than before, even with the heater humming. Outside the window, the slope was bathed in moonlight, and the tree line looked impossibly close. I caught myself staring at the glass, half expecting to see a figure standing just beyond the snow. And for a fleeting second, I thought I did. I barely slept that night. Every time I drifted off, I dreamed of someone standing in the snow, staring at our window. When I woke up, the image clung to me like frost, making me check the curtains again and again. Ryan laughed when I told him, but his eyes darted to the broken ski pole leaning against the wall. Even he wasn't brushing it off anymore. The next morning, we headed back out to the slopes, trying to shake off the unease. The air was crisp and clear, with the mountains stretching endlessly under the pale sky. For a while, skiing distracted me, and I almost forgot about last night. But halfway down a quiet trail, Ryan suddenly stopped, his skis carving a hard line into the snow. He was staring at something in the distance. I followed his gaze and froze. Just beyond the trees, I thought I saw a tall shape leaning slightly forward, like a person trying to stay hidden. It didn't move, didn't sway, and yet it felt alive, aware of us. Before I could speak, Ryan shouted, "Hey!" His voice cracked through the silent woods. But the figure was gone when I blinked, as if it had never been there. We kept skiing, but the mood had shifted. Ryan tried to laugh it off, saying, "Guess your ghost finally showed up," but there was no humor in his tone. His pole was strapped to his back, the cracked one he refused to throw away. It rattled slightly with each movement, the broken edges scraping faintly against each other. That sound made my skin crawl. Later, when we stopped to catch our breath, Ryan leaned his skis in the snow and planted the cracked pole upright. He tapped it twice, grinning like he was daring something to respond. I was about to tell him to cut it out when the pole split completely in half, collapsing into the snow with a dull thud. Ryan's grin disappeared instantly. He didn't even touch the pieces. The forest around us felt heavier after that, as if we'd crossed some invisible line. The air grew still, too still, and I couldn't hear the usual sounds of other skiers anymore. The silence pressed in, broken only by the distant sound of something crunching through the snow. Not from us, not from any skier nearby. It was slow, steady, and getting closer. Ryan muttered that we should head back, but I could hear the unease in his voice. We clipped into our skis quickly and pushed downhill, but no matter how fast we went, I felt something behind us. I didn't dare look back. When we finally reached the bottom, the relief was short-lived. Standing at the edge of the slope, just where the forest began, was the same tall shape, motionless, watching. Neither of us spoke on the lift ride back. We both saw it, and pretending otherwise would have been pointless. When we got to our room, Ryan shoved the broken pieces of his ski pole into the corner like he couldn't stand to touch them anymore. That night, neither of us slept much. Every creak of the lodge, every groan of the wind sounded like footsteps in the snow outside. Even now, thinking back, I can't shake the memory of that figure. It wasn't just the way it appeared and disappeared, it was the feeling that it wanted us to notice. The mountain hadn't felt like ours anymore after that. It felt claimed, like we'd stumbled into something that didn't want us there. And honestly, I don't think it was finished with us.